Hi guys, welcome to Delaware Studios, yet another Android programming tutorial. We will be looking at preferences, i.e. creating a settings page and implementing a change of behavior to an Android app from the settings preference. We have a sound visualizer application with different shape, triangle, square, sphere, all pulsating in a rotational direction. We would like to integrate a settings into this application to take care of showing bass sound, to show the mid-range, to show treble, to give shape colors, and also size multiplier. This will be only made possible with the use of shared preferences. To save a particular state of an Android application and get called on resume of the app to effect the preference change. Without much ado, let's dive into the writing of the preference and settings functionality of this particular application. So we're actually going to integrate the settings. We've created the settings activity whereby once we click, let me show you something there quickly. Once we click on the menu over here, we have the settings. So once you click on this, it's going to crash because we've not actually handled the call to the settings page. So we created another activity called settings activity. I'll be sharing the source code, but I only want to show you on how to implement preferences into an application. Let's look at the main activity, a high-level rundown of how this activity is. We have the default setup method. I want you to look at this quickly, whereby you can set the show bass, you can set the show mid, the show treble. These are all true. That's why you are seeing the three shapes showing. This is the bass is the circle, the treble, which is the mid rather, is the square, what about the treble is the triangle, you know. So we even set the minimum size scale to 1, that's the width of each shapes, and we set the color to red. So this is what we'll be actually handling when it comes to the settings, because any change in this particular method call is going to make a drastic change to this particular UI. So we have the unpause, whereby if you know the life cycle of an application, the unpause, the unresume, the unstart, the undestroy, and the unstop. You know, unpause, the M input reader, if it's not equals to null, it's going to shut down and it's going to call it's finished. What about unresume? It's going to restart the activity. So we have the setup permissions, you know, which is actually if you don't have the record audio permission, this is just checking the device or the hardware or the emulator, you know, if there's any record or audio permissions to set. So that's just what that's doing. And we have the on-create options menu that actually inflates the menu, which you're seeing at the top bar, at the toolbar. And we have the on options item selected. You need to override that as well to actually call the intent, which is pointing to the settings activity. So that takes us down to the settings activity. So this is where we're actually going to be starting writing the code, and I'll be showing you on how to declare the settings activity and how to create a shared preference. So right there in the settings activity, I would like to extend this activity app compact, very important app compact activity. Right there, we're going to override the onCreate method, which is protected, void onCreate, which is going to pass in the bundle as the parameter to save the present state, called save the instance state. Let's import the bundle. We get to call the superclass onCreate. We pass the saved instance state of the set, and we set content view to layout, activity settings, which we've not created, so we'll get to quickly create that. Activity settings. Let's quickly create that layout. We go to the layout. We have the default, which is activity main. Now we need a layout resource called activity settings. So that's fine. So we're actually going to use a fragment to call the settings details. So just follow me along. This will actually be a fragment, not a linear layout. A fragment whereby let's assign an ID to this fragment. Android ID. Let's give it activity settings. That's fine. We're going to give it a name. So we're actually going to point to the package com.getreferences studios.preference. I think it's preferences also. Let me just look at it. Preferences. We're going to create a settings fragment. So it's actually pointing to the fragment. We've not created that, so it can still look funky. Let's take away this orientation. We don't really need to set an orientation, and we're fine. So from here we'll be heading straight back to the settings activity, whereby we have the layout created, and we're going to actually call the action bar. Let's give it an action bar, which is equals to this class get support action bar. That's fine. So now we're going to set the action bar back button to look like an up button, so it's actually a back button if action bar is not equals to null. Call the action bar set display home as up enabled to true. This is better way to handle the back button, and we're gonna override the public boolean on options item selected. What about we pass in menu item with the object item? So let's create the body. Now this is for the menu. Let's import the menu item, and let's have it. So we're going to have the integer ID is equals to item dot get item ID. Close that right there. So when the home button is pressed, you take the user back to the main activity. So now let's say if the ID is equals to the Android dot r dot ID is home. Still going to set this right there in the manifest. Nav utils navigate up from syntax. So you pass this class as a parameter, and we get to return the super on options item selected. Pass the item parameter. So we close that. That is for the menu item, right? The settings activity. So we're actually going to look at the fragment, which is like the content of the activity. So we're going to actually create a settings fragment right inside the preference package called settings fragment. This is where the shared preference and other functionalities actually going to come to play. So from here we're going to actually extend we need to extend the preference fragment compact preference fragment compact, which implements let's unshared preference change listener unshared. No, we don't need the shared preference. We're actually going to create this shared preference, and also the preference on preference change listener. So let's have it this way. Now let's override public void method on create reference. We have bundle with a string s. So let's import that, which is the bundle, and now we're going to add the visualizer preference, which we actually defined in the XML. We have the XML that actually defines the preference. What about we're going to actually create that quickly now? So let's create the preference XML. We're going to actually create a directory right in the res, which we're going to call XML. Inside this XML, we're going to call the preference visualizer, or let's call it the preference. Let's right inside the XML rather. We're going to have XML resource file called pref visualizer. Click OK. Now right inside the preference visualizer, that's where we're going to have the checkboxes. We're going to use checkbox and edit text. These are the two major attributes that we'll be using. So let's get that done. The first checkbox, preference. We have Android default value, what we call at boolean preference show base default. So we get to create that, which we'll do quickly now. So we're actually going to create that in the values. We're going to have new value with source called bools. That's for booleans. Now inside the resources, first I'll have the first boolean with the name called preference show base default. True. The next one, name preference show mid range effort, false. While the third one, reference, show treble, defaults, that's false. So we have to go back to the preference. Oh no, that's actually going to be the XML, which is the preference visualizer, and we get to continue with the checkbox. This is the first checkbox, and now we have the Android key, which will be equals to at string. We've actually created the string with preference, show base key. We have Android summary of, which will actually be string, preference, show false. We're going to have the Android summary on at string, preference, show true, Android title at string, preference, show base label. No, those are the necessary things that we're going to have here. Now we're going to do for the mid-range. This is actually for the base. We still have the checkbox, preference, Android, default value at boolean. What about we're going to call preference, show mid-range, default. We're going to have key. What about we have the string, which is preference, show mid-range, key. We're going to have Android summary of string, which will be preference, show false. Next one is Android summary on at string, preference, show true. And we're going to have the title at string, preference, show mid-range, which is actually going to be label. We close that right there. Let's add for the treble, checkbox, preference, Android default value at boolean, and preference, show treble, default. Let's have the key, Android key, that's a string, preference, show treble key, Android summary of add string, reference, show false, Android, summary on, add string, reference, show true, and the title, add string, reference, show treble level. So we're going to have the edit text and the list view, which we're going to use that to wrap up. Let's close this. Let's have the edit text, edit text preference, that's for the edit text. You have Android, default value, add string, reference, size default, Android key, that's add string, preference, key, size key rather. Begin to have the title Android, which is add string, preference, size label. That's fine, that's for the edit text. So let's close that right there, and let's have the last one, which is actually the list preference. Android, default key, default value, add string, preference, color, red value, Android, entries. Now we need the array, that's array, preference, color, option, values. So we're going to create the array. Let's quickly do the key, add string, preference, color, key, and we have the title, add string, preference, color label. So that's fine. So we need to create the arrays XML right inside the values. I'm going to create arrays. So right inside here, we're going to have the first array name called preference, color, option levels. That was the array name. Close the right there. And the first item, add string, preference, color label, red, over there. Another item, add string, preference, color label blue, over there. Third one, at strings preference color label green. That's for the. Now let's have another array which will actually be for option values. Let me just copy this, just paste it. So color options values. Label color red, we take away the label. That's preference color red value. Blue value. Green value. That's that for the preference, which is actually the preference visualizer XML. So we have that set. All the preferences are set appropriately. Let's go back to the settings of fragment. Go back to the settings fragment. Now we have the onCreate preferences rather, onCreate preferences. Now let's add the visualizer preference. So we're going to add preferences from resource, which will be r.xml preference visualizer. So that's it. So let's create the structure of the unshared at override. We have public void unshared preference changed, which takes the shared preferences, shared preferences, a string, which is the key. That's the structure for that, and we're going to have the set preference summary, and we're still going to have some other methods that we're going to actually make calls to. Like now we're going to have private void set preference summary that takes preference string value and we're going to have on preference changed, you know, that's also another boolean to override. On preference change, but you have preference and the object new value. We're going to have the onCreate create method. I will pass the bundle saved instance state call the super on create. Save the instance state. Now you're going to get preference screen. And then get shared preferences. We'll get to talk about some details later on. Register on shared preference change listener. Quite long to this. So we're going to have another method called on destroy. That's override public void and destroy y equals super on destroy get preference screen get shared references register on shared preference change listener this. So that's fine. We'll get to create the structure of other methods. So let's go back to the onCreate preference. Let's get to finish up there, and we've called the preference visualizer over here, and we're going to call shared preferences the object, which equals to get preference screen actually get to import something here quickly. Import Android content shared preferences on shared preference change listener, so let's get to import that right there. So that takes care of these aspects of the code. So we get to import others while coding. So let's continue. We have the get preference screen, and we call the get shared preferences. That's fine. That's the onCreate preferences that takes bundle and the string. So that close that right there. Now we're going to call the preference screen from the Android preference called pref. Let's just name it pref screen rather, which be equals to get preference screen get preference screen and we're going to call the count equals to reference screen get preference count. So that's how to actually add the visualizer, and we actually define the XML. So we're going to go through all of the preferences and set up their preference summary. So we're going to actually use a for loop to do that. For the counter integer I equals to 0 when I is less than the count, and we're going to iterate I++. Now we call the preference p equals to preference screen to get preference, to pass I as parameter. So you don't need to set up preference summaries for checkbox preferences because they are already set up in the XML, using the summary off and the summary on. You actually saw that. So we're now going to test if the preference is not an instance of the checkbox preference. Actually going to do what? Call the string value equals to shared preferences get string, and we inside the string we're going to pass p as the get key, as the key value, comma. I'll make this empty. Close the right there. Now we call the set preference summary, two parameters and the value. That's just it. So now we're going to add the on preference change listener specifically to the edit text preference. How about the preference listener, which checks that the size is correct to the size preference? So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to call the preference find preference get string, inside there we call r string preference size key. We close the right there. We call the preference set on preference change listener to this class. Now we have the on shared preference changed that takes two parameters, the shared preferences and the key. So we're going to figure out which preference was changed. So let's get to do that. We call the preference find preference, and we pass the key. What's that? There's something here quickly. We will always need a version 7 preference. If you notice, we're just bringing in preference. Let's call it preference. We're going to need a version 7. So for us to really have that set up, we're not using the old preference. We need the latest preference, which is the version 7 from the support, Android support. So we're actually going to specify that in the creator script. So back to the creator script. I notice it's not actually picking up some boilerplate methods. So we need to do that. Compile com dot android dot support dot references version 7 25.1.0. so let's sync and let's get that imported right inside the source. Command support preferences, the version 7 25.1.0. We'll go straight back to the source in the settings fragment. Now we're going to call the version 7 settings preference instead of the old preference. So get to call this again. Preference. Still building up anyway. So we're gonna let the sync complete. So that's going to actually give us the library to use. Let's try it again. Still having the old version. Now it's building up. Okay. Repositories. Let me get to look at it again. 25. Let me just maintain 25.3 or 25.1.1.1 based on what I have already. I don't just need to download another Android support library. I should have this support 25.1.1. The sync, you can now import the version 7 art. Can you see that? Just click enter for version 7. Even over here you need to call preference, which is for the version 7. Just you don't need to actually point it right there. Right there now we need to try to clear out the deadlock, because we're actually having a preference for not for version 7, we're having for the previous version. So we just need to include version 7 to all our imports. So version 7 dot even for the preference also we need to include version 7 dot preference even for the preference screen version 7. Now it's going to be support version 7 support version 7. Even for checkbox, they're all version 7 version preference support version 7. For content, share that will stay. So we have that set. So if you notice, all error looks disappeared. So that's just it. Just introduce the version 7 support of preference. Don't use the older version. So that's just what is happening. Now we set the key. Let's continue with our code. If null is not equals to preference, so we're going to update the summary of the preferences. So it's going to be if not preference instance of checkbox reference string value shared preferences get string. Inside there you have the preference get key. So you set preference summary, you pass preference and also the value. So that's that for that. Now we need to also update the summary for the preference. So the value that the preference was updated and also the preference to be updated. So that's the essence of this set preference summary method. And now we also use the if statement. If the preference instance of list preference, now I can say the support version 7. So for the list preferences, we're going to figure out the label of the selected value. How about we're going to call the list preference the object list preference equals, so we cast the list preference as a preference integer preference index list preference find view find the index of value whereby I pass the value, and another if the preference index is greater than or equals to 0, we're going to have the list preference set summary. But we have list preference get entries, and we have the bracket for the preference index. Just this way you have that set appropriately. Now else if, that actually set the summary to that label. Now else if the preference instance of edit text preference, now we're going to set the summary to the values that's the simple string representation. So you have the preference that set summary to the value, just this way. Now we need to override the onPreference change, because this method should try to convert the new preference value to a float. So if it cannot, you're going to show a full error message and a return false. But if it can be converted to the float, check. You're going to check that the float is between 0 exclusively and 3 inclusively. So if it isn't, you're going to show an error message and return the false. If it is a valid number, you return true. So that is what we're going to do on the onPreference change, the boolean onPreference changes. So we're going to actually make that happen whereby we have the preference, the object of new value. So in this context, we're going to use the onPreference change listener for checking whether the size setting was set to a valid value or not. Now the first thing is the toast, the error equals to toast, make text, get context. So it's going to be please select a number between 0.1 and 3. So that in the toast. we have the toast length, not length, short. No, let's make it short. Let's close our toast. So we still need to show the toast anyway. I'll be done later. So now we're going to double check that the preference is the size preference. So we're going to have string size key equals to get string r.string dot preference size key. So if preference dot get key equals size key string of the string size equals to string new value. So a try statement, we call the float size equals to float parse float, we call the string size to the float, and if the number is outside of the acceptable range, it's going to show an error. So let's undo that. If the size is greater than 3, create a space, or size is greater than 3. This, why is this changing? It should be greater than 3, or size is less than or equals to 0. Need a parenthesis, size float. No, this, let me just undo it. There's a problem somewhere. If size is greater than 3, we have or size is less than or equals to 0. Now you call the error that shows. So that's the toast now. Whereby we are showing that. I return false. So we need to catch for an exception, which should be number format exception. Let's call it NFE. So you still call the error dot show, whereby you return false. So afterwards you're still gonna return true over here, return true. So that's that for this. Now we have get shared reference. So register on shared preference change listener. No, just have to correct that. And where are we having an error? Let's get to look at this. True, we need to close this out. That's fine. So we're going to have everything set. Now we need to make change in the main activity. There should be a change. Let's get to look at that, which is the main activity. We're going to actually, because we have, if we should look at the top, we have the onCreate, we have the default setup. We actually don't need that. We don't need the default setup. So we actually going to be changing that. So instead of default setup, this is actually going to be replaced with the word shared preference. So let's create a private void set up shared preferences. Now we're going to get all the values from the shared preference to set it up. So just follow along. We have shared. Before we continue with this, we need to extend or implement shared preferences on shared preference change listener. So with that, we're good to go. So now we call the shared preferences so equals to preference manager get default shared preferences, pass this into this particular parenthesis. Now you call visualizer view or set. You can see the way we're going to call this method now. Set show base called shared preferences dot get boolean get string r dot string. We're calling the preference show base key comma we get resources get boolean. Inside the boolean we call the r dot bool dot preference show base default, and should actually be three parentheses. Where we screwed up, let's get to look at this shared preference get string, whatever we call the r string preference show base key. So we need to close this right there before passing that. That's cool. So now we still call the visualizer for the treble and also for the mid. Now we call the set show mid. Now still call on shared preferences get boolean get string. Inside the string we call r string dot preference show mid range key. Do you get it that way? So right outside there you give a comma, you give a space, get resources, get boolean. Inside there we'll pass the boolean r bool, and we call the preference show mid range default, and we have that set right there. So we have the third one visualizer set show treble shared preferences get boolean get string r dot string dot preference This is actually going to be for the treble. Show treble key. Give a comma. Get resources. Get boolean r dot boolean dot preference treble default. That's that. So now we need to call load color from preferences. Actually go and load that from the shared preference. Now we call load size from shared preferences called shared preferences. So now let's register the listener called our shared preferences dot register on shared preference change listener. This. That's fine. Now we're going to have this method, the load color from preferences, and also the load size from shared preference. Let's have the private void load color from preferences. It's going to take the shared preference as a parameter. Everybody's going to have shared preferences. Now you have the shared preferences object. So right inside there we call the M visualizer. We set color. Shared preferences. We get string. Get string. Now r dot string dot preference color key. Give a comma. Get string r dot string preference color red value. That's fine. So outside there we're going to have the load private void load size from shared preferences, which takes the shared preference as a parameter. Now we get to have this. This is going to be a float for the minimum size that equals to float dot pass float. Call the shared preferences. Get string. Also in there we have the get string. This time we're going to get the string of preference size key. Give a comma. So we get string r dot string preference size default. Close right there. We call the M visualizer view and we set the minimum size scale to the minimum size created. That's that. Now we need to update the screen if the shared preferences change. This method is required when you make a class implement, or when you make an implementation of a class which is called on shared preference change listener. So we need to actually undo that as well. Now we're going to actually override No, it's actually outside this private method. It's outside. Let's override and bring it down so we have more space to work with. Now we have public void on shared preference changed, which takes shared preferences, shared preferences, string, which is key, all right. Now we're going to test if statements, or if the key equals getString r.string dot preference show base key Now you call the mVisualizer view, set show base, shared preferences, get boolean. How about you pass in the key, get resources, get boolean, r.bool dirt. It's actually going to be for the base, that's the preference base default, and we close it right there. That's cool. So do we need to also undo something? No, we need to test for the second one, which is for the mid. If key equals getString r.string dot preference show mid range key. It's actually, when it says show mid range key, that's fine. The same thing we did. We call the mVisualizer. We set show mid, and we call it shared preference. We get boolean, but you have the key, get resources, get boolean, r.boolean dot preference mid-range default. That's fine. We have another else if. This time if key equals the treble, so we're going to getString r.string dot preference show treble key. Call the mVisualizer view, set show treble, shared preferences, get boolean, key, get resources, get boolean, r.bool dot preference treble default. So else if, That's going to be for the color. So let's call the key equals get string. Now it's going to be r.string dot preference color key. We're going to call the load color from preferences, and we pass shed preference parameter. So another else if. This time we call the keys dot equals get string. Now the preference, which is the size, now the size of the key. So we call the float minimum size equals to float dot pass float shed preferences get string. Get string. Now we have the r dot string preference size key. And which is actually going to be need a comma, is going to be 1.0 to 3. So we're actually going to be 1.0, and close that right there, and we call the m visualizer view to set minimum scale. That's what the minimum scale anyway, so the minimum size will be that. We have that set. Before we move to the onDestroy, let's have the onDestroy method. I think we've set up the onDestroy. No, we don't have an onDestroy, so let's have the onDestroy. There must be an onDestroy for the life cycle of the activity. Protected void onDestroy. So now we have the super onDestroy, and we unregister visualize activity, that's the main activity, as an on preference change listener to avoid any memory leaks. So we call the preference manager dot get default shared preferences this, and let's unregister on shared preference chain listener to this. That's the onDestroy method. And now we have the set. We also have the onCreate options menu, whereby we got the menu inflator, which is the visualizer. We have the on options items selected. We have the on pause and on resume, which we've actually done earlier, and we have the permission. So this is just how to set up the shared preference. You can see the way we saved values in shared preference, and at the same time the way it's being called, and used to actually make a change of the treble, the bass, and also the colors. This is just what we call shared preference used. And in the manifest, we need to key in some permissions. The first permission is the settings, which you can see, and also the record audio. So after this, we need to register the activity, which is the settings activity. So let's quickly register that activity. Android name, no. What about this activity? We have Android name, which is dot settings activity. Android label, which is string, should be action settings. So now the parent Android parent activity name, which is main activity, that's the parent. We'll close that. So inside there we have the metadata, Android name, we call the Android support parent activity, so that the up, the back button will work. Android value, this is main activity. We close that right there. So we have the application set, and I'll be testing this right in an emulator, so don't go anywhere. Lest I forget, you need to call the setup shared preference and also the setup permissions. So instead of the default setup now, we call that, take that up. So we call the setup shared preferences method. So now we have to delete this so that it's actually going to use this particular method. So stand by for the launcher. Yeah, we'll go with the application, the preferences. So now let's go to the settings. I can see that we only have the treble alone, pulsating and rotating. Now let's go to the settings. You can see we have only show treble, so let's show the mid-range. Let's get to look at it. Can you notice that we have the square attached to the triangle? Let's go back to the settings. Let's show the base and back again. Can you see the now tree? So there's the base sound in circle. So that's that. You can see how preferences is actually manipulating the activity. Now let's increase the size of the multiplier. We only have 1 to 3, so we can only, let's make a change here. Let's just do maybe 2. Let's see, maybe to accept 2. That's fine. So let's look at it. Can you see that the size increased? The size of the shapes actually increased. So we got to fix this. What about we need the entry values? Since we created an array, so let's add this Android entry values, which calls the @array. This should be in small / preference color options values. You get it? So we're gonna try again and see. Let's run again. So now we're gonna pick a value. So let's get to look at the color. How can you see it? The shape is red already, so we have the ability to change now to blue. Back. Can you see that? Let's change to the third color, which is green. Can you see that? So that's just it. So thank you very much for hanging out with me throughout this tutorial, and please don't hesitate to subscribe to my channel.